Gaza War, day 235. No end in sight. In fact, there have been a couple of statements today along the lines that I've been telling you about that from Hamas leaders saying there's nothing to talk about. We don't have anything to discuss with Israel at the moment. If they want to stop the atrocities, if they want a complete ceasefire and a withdrawal from Gaza, they can do it. We're not going to negotiate over that anymore. So uh, that's what a couple of their leaders told the media in recent days. It's a very consistent message that I've seen. So that is more on the no end in sight front, especially since, as I've also been saying, it's very clear that Israel has written off their hostages. They don't want them back. They don't want to trade for them. And all they want to do is imprison and collect and, of course, murder more Palestinians. So there are news of dozens of new arrests, detentions of Palestinians in the West Bank in recent days, as well as the concentration camps that are being managed by the Interior Ministry of Israel of detainees from Gaza, where unspeakable tortures and murders are taking place. So that's what we have in terms of the possibilities for a ceasefire or a near term end to the war. That is not happening for all of these reasons. On the international front, we have, you've probably heard, more European countries recognizing the state of Palestine, Spain, Norway, Ireland. Ireland, Irish activists said they should have done it a long time ago, but better late than never. And Irish activists I've also seen saying online that they should do much more, and as well as Spain. Spanish activists and politicians have been quite strong in terms of what they've been saying. There's also an interesting thing you may have seen in The Guardian. They published a story on the Israeli dirty war on the International Criminal Court. This is the previous uh, prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda. And the head of Mossad apparently threatened Fatou Bensouda personally, his family, etc. He said, "You don't want to be getting into things that could compromise your security or that of your family." This is quoted in The Guardian. The Guardian is an ultra Zionist British public imperialist publication. They occasionally do token semi-leftists in their comment is free section, but make no mistake what The Guardian is, and therefore it is a surprising thing to see it in The Guardian, but tokenism is what it is and is part of the overall strategy. So while it's somewhat surprising, you should never be that surprised, especially now when Israel is committing atrocities that are shocking to even the most disillusioned, that you'll see a little bit of Western dissent. You've probably seen Western politicians clutching their pearls over the tent massacres. We will get into the tent massacres in a minute or two, but you've probably seen Western politicians clutching their pearls. I saw a tweet that I liked about that where they said, so we have politicians complaining about things or expressing their horror at things that they are directly responsible for. And that's exactly the spectacle of the past 2 days of tent massacres, where Israel uses 1,000-pound incendiary munitions on people sleeping in tents. Well done, Israel. You really have outdone yourselves, and and nobody any longer expects anything less. So on the West Bank, we have fighting in Tulkarm tonight. Tulkarm, the Shweika suburb, the Israelis are conducting raids. Saraya Al-Quds in Tulkarm says they've used explosive devices on military vehicles, and they're fighting hard against the Israelis invading the Shweika suburb. There are also Israeli raids in Khalil. I used to call Khalil Hebron on this program. I've only ever seen it referred to in resistance media as Khalil. So I think I'll defer to them and call it Khalil from now on. So Khalil is the Palestinian name for the town of Hebron. Hebron is notorious for having a small number of incredibly aggressive settlers lording it over a much larger proportionately population of Palestinians. There are settlers attacking Palestinians in Khalil as well. So now we go to Gaza and a lot of fighting in Rafah. There was what the Israelis call a difficult security incident in Rafah today. That is code for they lost a lot of Israeli soldiers. It looks like the resistance media reported a pre-rigged building detonated with Israeli soldiers inside. That seems to be the source of the difficult incident. There have also been sniper attacks, mortar attacks, many mortar attacks on the Netzarim corridor. That's the corridor that Israel hopes to occupy long term. That's the corridor that connects across the middle of Gaza, the road, and that goes to the American pier. Shall I tell you about the American pier? Because I had seen reports that the American pier was falling apart, and I didn't believe it. I thought maybe there were some detachable parts that were coming off and that it's some kind of puzzle Lego based construction as it is. So I wasn't sure what, if anything, was happening there. But today I saw reports from really American imperialist sources that show the pier essentially floating away. And the pier does not look like it did at the beginning. It pretty much looks both inactive and as if most of it has just floated away. So that's the ignominious end to this totally bizarre story behind which I had assumed there was a lot of sinister intent and possibilities for gas theft, ethnic cleansing, resupplying the Israelis. The Israelis didn't want any humanitarian aid going into Gaza. They're trying to starve and kill people in Gaza. Why would they allow the US to distribute aid through a pier? That was always the unexplained part of the story for me. And that was what I could never wrap my head around. And I thought that meant that the Americans must be lying. It turns out the Americans just built this thing and let it float away into the sea. So that was apparently $320 million, a boondoggle that was never politically feasible. It was always trying to contradict the hunger plan that America was helping Israel to implement. And now it's that contradiction has been cleared up with the pier falling apart and floating away. So that's the end of that. Appears to be the end of the story in terms of the pier. You've probably heard Egypt and Israel have been fighting. There have been at least two clashes between Israeli troops and Egyptian troops at the border in Rafah. The Camp David Accords, which neutralized Egypt, the biggest and most dangerous threat to Israel, the biggest and most potentially powerful Arab country, neutralized by the Camp David Accords, by the sneaky maneuverings of Henry Kissinger and Anwar Sadat. I talked about this in many, many sit reps ago, probably a couple months ago. I went through a book by, I think Hazem Kandil is his name, and a couple of other sources like General Shazli are describing the Egyptian system, the Camp David Accords, the 1973 war, the 1967 war with Egypt, and how the peace accord with Egypt is what enables Israel to do everything that it does to the Palestinians. Having Egypt be a collaborator with Israel, having giant Egypt be a collaborator with relatively tiny Israel has multiplied Israel's power and ability to project power in the direction of the Palestinians immensely, uncalculably. And so what does Israel do? They go and violate the Camp David Accords. They occupy the Philadelphia corridor that is not supposed to be occupied by Israel. They occupy the Palestinian side of the border, which is not supposed to be occupied by Israel. And then they go and start shooting Egyptian soldiers. They cannot help but show their unbelievable contempt for everybody that is not Israeli. That is, they just can't. They can't do it. They think they have the right to kill anybody. And Egypt has been so submissive to the Israelis for so long that the Israelis probably couldn't conceive of the possibility that Egypt would fight back. Egypt still isn't fighting back, let's be completely clear, but a couple of Egyptian soldiers certainly didn't want to get shot without answering back with the weapons that they had in their hands. They fired back. Some Israelis were injured. At least one and maybe two Egyptian soldiers were killed. There was a funeral tonight. The crowds chanted at the funeral of a soldier, Islam Ibrahim. He was a young soldier. I mean, these are very pretty young men at that border, and in his town of Isbet Jaballah, and the crowds were chanting "Down with Israel." So things could get more complicated for the Egyptian regime in their hopes of stably collaborating with Israel forever. The tent massacres in Rafah we have to talk about. They started as we were recording our tanky therapy session on Sunday with Sina and Joe. We stopped recording, we posted the video, and then we realized that Israel had been massacring people with new kinds of weaponry on targets in tents, sleeping in tents on this Israeli holiday where they light fires, apparently. So it's maybe they did it purposely to coincide with that holiday or something, but they burned dozens of people alive, they beheaded babies, they did all of the horrific things that they falsely accused the resistance of doing. They did all of those things, every single one of those things that they falsely lied that the resistance was doing. And of course, beyond expressing their horror at the explosions in Rafah, the Western politicians and media, etc., have returned to supporting Israel and condemning Hamas and all of the rest. There was a fake audio file that the Israelis released of two Gazan people talking. The production and posting of a fake audio between Palestinians talking to each other is basically a hallmark of a new Israeli atrocity, a qualitative Israeli atrocity. The last time I remember them doing it was when they bombed the first hospital. So after they bombed and destroyed and dismantled every other hospital, except two or three that they're attacking now in Rafah, they didn't need to release audio files, but the first one they did. And so this was the first tent massacre. There have been many others. There have been a couple of others already since they did it on Sunday. But for the first tent massacre, they took the time to make a fake audio file and post it to the internet saying that it wasn't them and that it was Hamas's own weaponry that lit all these people on fire and beheaded them and destroyed their tents. Speaking of, and it was also a response to the International Court of Justice ordering them to stop the assault on Rafah. What else would they do except attack Rafah? That is the Israeli way of showing their contempt for, again, everybody that isn't them, everybody that isn't part of their superior racial configuration. Speaking of people who aren't in their superior racial configuration, an Indian politician, an Indian American politician named Nimrata Randhava. You probably have heard of Nimrata Randhava. Apparently, she has some other American name. She went and signed some bombs and said, finish them. And America loves Israel. I don't know, I'm not sure why an Indian person named Nimrata Randhava would say America loves Israel. You would think she would speak on behalf of India, but anyway, it is what it is. So Nimrata Randhava did that, and that made the news. That made the news today. So Turkey, apparently the Israeli embassy in Turkey has been set on fire. So, and there are other in Jordan, there are places that have been relatively quiet over the past few months, have flared up again in terms of demonstrations in the face of these new atrocities, this kind of qualitatively new atrocity in the tent massacre and Rafah, the tent massacres. So the Jordanian protests, as you can imagine, have the same kinds of fiery slogans that we had before they quieted down, before they were crushed. Sorry, I just saw news that there was another Egyptian army soldier, Islam Ibrahim Abdul Razak. I think that might be the same guy, but there were two soldiers who died. Um, what else do we have? Yeah, Alon Mizrahi, I've been telling you about his tweets. He actually said something else that I thought was really good. He said something like, there's going to be more people who are afraid now, who realize they don't care anymore, and that process is not something that's going to stop. And I actually think that's correct. I think that there's going to be more and more people who are willing to are not willing to be cowed by the threats and squealing. A lot of the a lot of the a lot of the how do I call it? Automatic accusation of anti-Semitism against anti-racist and anti-genocide people, that's pretty much over. Nobody cares about that anymore. And that's because it anti-racists always wanted to incorporate anti-Semitism because we are aware of the history of European anti-Semitism and Nazism. And the the accusation of anti-Semitism was meant to appeal to our consciences. It was meant to say, you're anti-racist, and to be consistent, you have to be against anti-Semitism, and we are. So it was never a big deal for us to say, yeah, well, of course we're opposed to anti-Semitism as well as all forms of discrimination. There was always this kind of statement that we're against all forms of discrimination. The thing is, what the Zionists didn't realize or didn't seem to understand was that it was really that anti-racists were actually consistent. So it's not that we believe that Israelis are a superior race worthy of more consideration than everybody else. Anti-racists believe that everybody is part of the human race and there's no superior races. And so when it became really clear that Zionists were deploying this anti-Semitism accusation to justify genocide and to silence people who are trying to fight against genocide, it really has lost all of its value. It's not, we never adopted that because we were afraid. We adopted it because we're actually anti-racist. And so trying to threaten people and make them afraid by calling them anti-Semites, that was never why that accusation worked. The accusation worked because anti-racists don't want to be racist. And now that we realize that accusation is coming entirely from a group of extreme racists, it's lost its power. And that's the kind of thing Alon Mizrahi is talking about, right? He's talking about how there are more and more people who who are going to realize that what they fear for themselves is less than what the Palestinians are facing already. And the Yemenis are a great example of people who are very explicit about that, right? They've exposed themselves to being bombed by the Americans and the British and whoever else because they insisted on imposing an economic blockade on Israel and imposing costs on Israel for committing genocide. And they are continually ramping up their efforts. I believe they're in phase 4. They have not revealed what 5 and 6 are, but they have said for phase 5 and 6 are coming. You probably heard maybe the Chinese foreign minister said the Gaza genocide is of course the cause, but we also want the blockade to stop. The Yemenis are obviously going to ignore that. But this is kind of the whole story in Al Jazeera that sparked a little bit of debate on Twitter today. It was a bit burying the lead because the main point is that this plea by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi happened at a meeting of Arab leaders in China. Arab country leaders are in China for a summit between Arab leaders and the Chinese. And that is a big deal. That's a big story. What's going to come out of that summit? What kinds of new decisions and infrastructural projects and diplomatic initiatives are going to come out of that meeting? That's an interesting question. Egypt is at that meeting. Saudi Arabia is at that meeting. There's going to be BRICS implications for that meeting. That's an interesting meeting. And the fact that China asked them to stop and they're not going to listen is a tiny part of the importance of that meeting, I would say. Just so we're totally clear, Yemen also spent the past few days hitting, I think, around 5 different targets in the Indian Ocean, including U.S. Navy targets and ships headed to and from Israel. So Yemen's blockade is going nowhere. Iraq launched, I believe, 3 drones against Eilat, drones and missiles on Eilat port in Israel. These were apparently bigger, kind of qualitative, not qualitative, I've been using that word too much, but they are on the big side of what Iraq has sent to Israel so far. So escalations likely in response to the Rafah tent massacres. As Hezbollah, there are some amazing things going on. There have been Iron Dome batteries disabled. There's been a major rocket attacks on the Israeli settlement of Kiryat Shimona. That is one of the more important settlements of the north. It's mainly depopulated. Another settlement, Margaliot, has said they're not accepting anybody coming to their town, including the Israeli military. They don't want anybody. They feel betrayed and they don't want anybody. But fires in Kiryat Shimona, Margaliot saying they don't want anybody coming, disabled Iron Dome batteries. And today there's video of Hezbollah fighters basically walking right up to a target, an Israeli target, and firing rocket-propelled grenades from close up, undetected, unanswered. So it's like they can just walk into Israel now. Simply walk. One apparently does simply walk into Israel now from the north if one is Hezbollah and has spent the last 8 months destroying technical and surveillance equipment as well as fortified military targets and equipment. So that is also a clear escalation from Hezbollah in response to the Rafah tent massacre. And that takes us to the short speech by Hassan Nasrallah, Secretary General of Hezbollah today. He spoke today to thank people. His mother died. You probably heard over the past couple days. A couple days ago, I guess his mother died, and he wanted to thank people for their condolences and talked about his mother and growing up and all the things that his mother did for him and how many children she had and their relationship between his mom and his son, her grandson, who was martyred, Hadi Nasrallah, who was martyred on the battlefield with Israel. But then after that more personal message and the thanks for the condolences, he talked specifically about the Rafah massacre. And he, to me, to my ears, when I was listening, I took two main messages from that speech. And one is a very contemptuous dismissal of international law and the international legal institutions of the ICC and the ICJ. He said, who's stupid enough to believe after all of this that international law protects you? He was kind of rhetorically asking, you think we should lay down our arms now? You think we should lay down our arms and let the international community protect us the way they protected the people of Rafah? He said, no, the only protection we have is from our own hands, from our own weapons. If Rafah, if the massacres in Rafah, where they are told people to go to this safe place and bombed it, if that doesn't teach you that the international community declared that they have to stop the massacre in Rafah, and they went right into Rafah and they did a big massacre in Rafah. And he said, if that doesn't tell you that the international law and international legal framework is useless, I don't know if you're asleep. He said something like, I don't know if you're paying attention, but it was a very contemptuous discussion of international law and the uselessness of international law. And then the last thing he said, he kept referring to, and the resistance now just routinely calls the Israelis Nazis, like my friend Joe Emersberger. He never misses a chance to call Israel Nazi Israel. He always appends that adjective to it. So Nasrallah mentioned that comparison multiple times and concluded one of the last things he said was, there's no place for this entity in our region. So that's another sign of the no end in sight. I think he's also preparing people for this war with Israel that is, I cannot imagine it. I can't imagine it escaping that scenario at this point. The way that Israel is behaving, the the impossibility of imagining Israel stopping, the way they've written off their prisoners, the way that they're so proud of their atrocities, the way that the inability or unwillingness of the pro-Israel system across the West, across the media, across the Western political parties to apply any pressure, to apply any accountability, to do anything except mindlessly and consciencelessly continue to pass weapons and funding and diplomatic cover on to the Israelis as they commit horrific massacre after horrific massacre. It just tells me that the chances of this ending through some mutually beneficial diplomatic settlement after all of this blood and death, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine. Which means that the war just goes on, and a long war of attrition, as Abu Ubaidah said days ago, they're ready for. So that's where we're at. That's the situation that I'm reporting on tonight. Things are getting worse. They're getting worse for Israel, and the humanitarian situation is getting worse and worse for the people of Gaza, people in the West Bank. And that's the that's the race, the disintegration of Israeli society and the Israeli military and their ability to deliberately bring about the destruction and genocide of the Palestinian people. Those are the two those are the two events that continue to proceed on this timeline that we are watching. I wanted to say I noticed in the comments people saying that I deliver without sufficient emotion, that I need to add more energy. This is what I do, guys. I can't do anything different than what I'm doing. I can't apply cartoonish, energetic, what affect to my um, presentation. And when I do make these presentations, I do somewhat turn the emotion off deliberately. I would advise that you do the same when you're consuming this stuff. Uh, it's not possible to follow these events and with full emotional vulnerability and do that day after day and report after report. If I did, I would not. If I did that, I would not be able to actually work. So I'm not going to apologize for my for my perceived lack of emotion, and I just wanted to offer that by way of explanation for those who are critics of that. Don't post about it. Don't post any critique of it. I'm just going to delete them and maybe remove your maybe remove you from the channel. So don't don't do that. And just recognize that everybody's dealing the best they can. And you're gonna have to go to another channel if you want a little more oomph in the delivery. All right. So I will hang on, and you should hang on. Hang in there. We're gonna be here for a long time. This is gonna go on for a long time, and it's gonna be horrible. There's gonna be a lot more massacres and a lot more of this before the end. So hang in there, like and subscribe and comment. Not on the delivery, please, but comment. Please continue with your extremely insightful comments that I get a lot out of. At this point, half the reason I make these videos is to read some of the long comment essays that people are writing in the comments here. So I really appreciate those. And I appreciate you guys showing up and this little community that we have here. So please, yeah, keep doing that for the channel and for each other and for me. And I will certainly see you in the next one.